Shall we pray? May I speak in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. I think you have been told that I was called only last week, at the last minute, to fill the gap. And Habib was very much sympathizing with me. He was almost crying, oh, I know it is, yeah. I know it is hard. But when you are called, for me, when you are called this late, the advantage is that you can say anything. So that's the advantage, yeah. And yesterday, actually, one of you asked me, are you going to preach? When he heard that I was called in the last minute, I said, yes, I'm going to preach. So you should expect my sermon. However, I want to start with thanks. I want to begin by thanking Uspg for inviting me to take part in this conference. It is an honor to me, and I really appreciate that. And this demonstrates how the mode of mission has shifted from one-way process to what we call partnership in mission. Partnership is about working together. We have already said a little bit about that. It is about sharing our experiences and resources. For me, the Church of God would be very poor if it consisted of people with similar race, similar background, similar culture, and similar experience. But since we are different, and yet one in Christ, this is why we can enrich one another. The church in Africa is the church of the poor. That is always or often under pressure. But even with our poverty, I believe that the church in the West has much to learn from us. The one thing that you can learn from us is our experience of trusting and believing in God in the context of suffering. In Africa, we confront death every day, even premature death. We do not glory in suffering, and the church is working tirelessly to eradicate suffering. But as far as our faith in God is concerned, suffering is neutral, in the sense that it is neither good nor bad for trusting in God. People, rich or poor, can trust in God, not because of what they get from God, but because without God, our life cannot attain full humanity and meaning. African people like to sing. If you go, you can see. They like to dance. If you go to our villages in Africa today, people are hungry. They have nothing to eat, but they still sing, they still dance, and yet they could be dying. For me, suffering reminds us that in reality, we are not created human beings, but human becomings. Our perfection is in heaven, where there is no more suffering. So let us continue to work in partnership. Let us continue to learn from one another. Let us continue to encourage one another for God's glory. Something about the province of Tanzania. The Anglican Church of Tanzania has 28 dioceses and 27 bishops at present. One diocese has no bishop yet. I want to set my clock so that I don't I don't forget my time. Yeah, 27 bishops, as well as an archbishop. It lies in East Africa, and its members are to be found on the mainland of Tanzania, formerly referred to as Tanganyika, and on the island of Zanzibar. In the mainland, Christianity is said to be 61%, and the population is 44%. In Zanzibar, in the mainland, or in the country as a whole, Christianity is 61%, and Islam is 35%. Whereas in Zanzibar, Christianity is only 2%, and Islam 98%. The current president of Tanzania is doing his best to tackle corruption, although some international organizations criticize him for suppressing democracy. The social context of the country. The relationship between Christians and Muslims has generally been good enough, although on a few occasions, fundamental Muslims have tended to be aggressive. Politically, the country is under a multi-party system. There are complaints that the ruling party is using its power to silence the voices of the opposition parties. Economically, the country still relies heavily on subsistence farming or subsistence agriculture. Rainfall in the country is not even. So very often there's in some parts people have enough to eat, while in others, such as the central part where I come from, there is food shortage. About my diocese, the Diocese of Central Tanganyika. The Diocese of Central Tanganyika, where I minister, lies in Dodoma region, in the center, which is now the capital, covering 3 districts. It is the mother diocese of 19 other dioceses in the country. Until recently, it was the only diocese that ordained women in the province, although 3 more dioceses have now, in the last 2 years, have started ordaining women. The diocese has 270 parishes, and 300 priests, of which 50 are women, of which 3 are canons. I've got 3 canons who are women, of which 1 is an area dean, of which 1 is principal of our theological college. I can say that women are the backbone of the church in Tanzania. I can say that. When I go for confirmations, it's the women who will meet me and dance. When you go to the church, in the church, the church is full of women. Yeah, so they are if you take away women, no people in the church. Men. It is true, because you find 300 women, maybe 4 men, just 4. So if you take away women, no church. So I can say that the empowerment of women is therefore part and parcel of our ministry in our diocese. In total, the diocese has 500,000 church members. Coming to our topic, what is prophetic voice? I've been asked to share my thoughts and experience on how the church in Tanzania exercises her prophetic ministry. To begin with, we first need to understand what being prophetic means. I suggest that to be prophetic is to speak on God's behalf in a way that is particularly inspired by God himself. In the Old Testament, the majority of the prophets were not priests. They were people, lay people, who believed that they were inspired by God to bring God's message to his people in the Old Testament. Many of them were ordinary people. For instance, Amos. Amos was a farmer looking after sycamore trees. He says in chapter 7, verse 14, I was neither a prophet nor son of a prophet, but I was a shepherd, and I also took care of sycamore trees. So he was an ordinary person, not a priest. The prophets were different from the priests in the sense that their message was believed to come from above, directly inspired by God to speak to the people. So that's how their message was from above, while that of the priest was from below, as they represented people before God through sacrifice. Prophets were forth-tellers in the sense that they told the truth about contemporary issues surrounding the society. They condemned injustice, we've already said, defended the poor and the oppressed, and appealed for mercy towards the poor. Where necessary, they confronted kings and the status quo to present God's message. We have prophets who did that in the Old Testament. Prophets were also foretellers in the sense that they predicted the future and delivered oracles about impending judgment, but also redemption. Coming to the New Testament, the Holy Spirit, we see the Holy Spirit is now poured upon the believers and the church as a whole, so that all the believers now can speak prophetically. That is Joel chapter 2 compared Acts chapter 2. Having said this, what about the prophetic voice of the church today? First, the importance of lay participation in the prophetic mission of the church. Since the majority of the prophets were ordinary lay people, my first point is that in order for the church to fulfill its prophetic mission of proclaiming the gospel, lay participation is crucial. In fact, the church in Africa grows not because it has wonderful clergy. On the contrary, we probably have the most unlearned clergy. Rather, the church in Africa grows because we have ordinary Christians who are open enough to share the good news of the risen Christ with their neighbors. And I believe that this kind of sharing does not require months or years spent in a theological college. In my diocese, we have this emphasis that if a church invests more on ordinary Christians than on clergy, that church will grow. But if the church invests more on clergy than on ordinary Christians, it is possible to witness a church dying before one's own eyes. The role of the clergy has more to do with maintenance than growth. Church growth is always in the hands of ordinary Christians. A few years ago, maybe here is where I preach now. A few years ago, my diocese had an outreach area where the majority were still members of African traditional heritage. What we did was to send teams of ordinary Christians who visited every village, entered every house, shared the gospel with every family, prayed with every person, and casted out demons. The results were overwhelming. I remember going to one village with an Australian priest. There we met a Maasai man who was married to 14 wives, and he had 72 children. The Australian priest was so surprised, and he said to me, "Dickson, this is no longer a family. It is the United Nations." But eventually, this Maasai man, with all his 14 wives, became Christians. You may ask me, what did he do with his 14 wives? This brings me to my second point, namely that our prophetic voice should always involve interpreting the gospel into the local culture. This is what we call contextualization or inculturation of the gospel. When missionaries came to Africa for the first time, they taught Africans to behave like Europeans, to walk like Europeans, to eat like Europeans, and to speak like Europeans. They dismissed the African music from church. Above all, polygamists who accepted the gospel were told to abandon their wives and remain with one before they were baptized. That was the approach. This practice caused further problems. When we began reading the Bible with our own African eyes, we discovered aspects of continuity and discontinuity between the Bible and African culture. Continuity in the sense that polygamy is an accepted practice in the Old Testament. Discontinuity in the sense that the New Testament favors monogamy. Consequently, we had to contextualize the gospel, which was eventually supported by Lambeth Resolution 26 on church and polygamy, which says, this conference upholds monogamy as God's plan and as an ideal relationship of love between husband and wife. Nevertheless, recommends that a polygamist who responds to the gospel and wishes to join the Anglican Church may be baptized and confirmed with his believing wives and children on the following conditions. 1, that the polygamist shall promise not to marry again. That the polygamist shall promise not to marry again as long as any of his wives at the time of his conversion are still alive. Second, that the receiving of such a polygamist has the consent of the local Anglican community. Third, that such a polygamist shall not be compelled to put away any of his wives on account of the social deprivation they would suffer. 4, and recommends that provinces where the churches face problems of polygamy are encouraged to share information of their pastoral approach to Christians who become polygamists so that the most appropriate way of discipling and pastoring them can be found, and that the ACC be requested to facilitate the sharing of that information. That is what Lambeth Resolution 26 says. Of course, we know that the gospel must be above culture. This option is therefore only for those who accept Jesus for the first time while they are in polygamy. There is no option for a Christian who was single or in monogamy and decides to add another wife. There is no option there. And we thank God, however, that polygamy appears to be dying natural death for economical reasons. So it's no longer a big challenge. Third, prophetic voice and the poor. I have pointed out how Old Testament prophets defended the poor, the weak, and the oppressed. If the church is to be relevant in the society, it has to do the same. The church in my diocese has done this through word and deed. When HIV/AIDS was at its height, there were many orphans in the villages in our diocese. What we did was to support 700,000 orphans to go to school by providing them with nutritious porridge, school uniforms, blankets, shoes, and school materials. We managed to support these children from primary school level to university level and other vocational school. 2 weeks ago, I was in Jerusalem before coming here. I met one of these children in Jerusalem, now studying agriculture. And he was so grateful. And he wrote something for the diocese. Since Dodoma is semi-desert and always dry, my diocese has also taken a lead in teaching people in poor families across the diocese conservation agriculture. Conservation agriculture is about using the right seeds and the right farming methods to maximize harvest. We have about 20 villages where we teach this, and surprisingly, the government now relies on the diocese when it comes to teaching people about conservation agriculture. We have also helped farmers to set up savings and borrowing schemes called Vikoba to help them to do conservation agriculture and also small business. In the area of environment, we have also taken a lead by encouraging every parish to plant approximately 100 trees we are taking the lead because government officials are silent. When people are cutting down trees for charcoal and they do bad farming, the government officials are just quiet. They don't say anything. Electricity and cooking gas has never benefited people with a low income, both in urban and rural areas. With the effect from this coming rain season, we hope to start providing poor families with seedlings, which they can plant to reduce the effects of climate change. In our diocese, we have this motto. Our motto is, we lead and others follow. I have been encouraging my clergy to function not only as preachers of spiritual salvation. They must also as well teach people by example on issues of soil conservation and environment. For me, this is also prophetic voice. Fourth, the church's prophetic voice should be directed against corruption and injustice. The current president of Tanzania, as I've said, is very much tackling corruption, and the church has very much been behind him. Nonetheless, many have voiced concern that the state seems to be suppressive of opposition parties. In Tanzania, when it comes to addressing such issues, we often do this at the ecumenical level. We do it together. We call Christian Council of Tanzania, CCT, we call it. In some cases, we come together with the Catholics and the Pentecostals. We come together. And speak with one voice on bigger issues. On bigger issues, we come with Muslims and Christians together. Again, we address these issues with the one powerful voice. Very often, the church expresses its prophetic voice either through special pronouncements, also occasional homily at worship, or face-to-face with government officials, including the president. Last but one, as for prophets were foretellers. They were foretellers, which means they prophesied about the future, warning people of an impending judgment, and where necessary, giving them hope. Central in this was their message about the remnant, Prior to Babylonian exile, for instance, the prophets told the people of Judah that they would go to Babylon, to Babylonian captivity. They would go there as punishment for their sin. Nonetheless, they gave them hope that the remnant would survive and return. The remnant was a small group of Jews who would return from Babylonian captivity and continue to serve God more faithfully, as you can read in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 11 to 16. This prophetic voice of the remnant, for me, is particularly important for our Anglican communion today. Issues of sexuality have almost destroyed the community. The church is not only divided, but also there is suspicion and hate amongst believers. Jesus' command to love one another has deliberately been overlooked. What is prophetic voice in all this? What is our prophetic voice? The answer for me to this question seems to be that the only hope is in this theology of the remnant. After the church goes through all this process of misunderstanding, disagreement, purification, the remnant will survive. By the remnant, I mean a group of believers who are committed to God, but also to the Anglican values. Therefore, we should not lose hope. Finally, but not least, for the long-term sustainability of the church, our prophetic voice today in Tanzania, in my diocese, is to help our people to open their eyes and see the locally available resources and use them to enhance their livelihood. For a long time, the church in Tanzania has relied on external aid, which for me hasn't helped anything. It has helped, yeah, but it's from hand to mouth. This external aid was helpful temporarily, but it does not help for the sustainability of the church. So we have what we call CCMP, Church and Community Mobilization Process. And I put more emphasis, so much emphasis on this. The intention is to help people that we do not need external support. We have resources there around them. If can be used, that can enhance their life, but also can make the church sustainable. We have everything around us in Africa. We just need to open our eyes, but also to transform our mindset so that we can stand on our own. Once again, thank you for inviting me to share everything that I had. And may God bless you indeed. Thank you.